Hi, just a short hello from Wilton Library. I'm Andrea Sato. I work on adult programs, and thank you for coming today. We're very pleased to present SpedNet's presentation by Dr. Marcia Eckert on psych testing. We're also pleased to partner with SpedNet, the Wilton Public Schools, and Newtown Sped PTA. We hope that you'll come back for more programs on different topics, but we know that these are particularly important to parents and their families. So just to note, this presentation will be recorded and the link will be shared on the SpedNet website and the Wilton Library's YouTube channel as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eve Kessler.
What SpedNet is for 25 years, we've been a support and networking group for parents of kids with special needs. Started when my son, who is now 30, was 3.5 in preschool services, and have been having presentations and webinars ever since. Our website, spednet.org, is a wealth of information. Not only does it have our Guide to Special Services, which is free online guide to special services that we worked on with the school district a number of years ago, and that's been updated. But we have all of the videos of all of our webinars and all of our in-person presentations on the website with the PowerPoints and materials, articles by the different speakers. So it's a fabulous website. We are so thrilled that you're here. This is the first time we've tried to go live, and apparently for 100 people who signed up, many of them thought that this was still on the webinar. I don't know what to say. But this will be sent out if you want to share it with your spouse or with your team. This is dense information that, a lot of people who did sign up are staff members from the different school districts who always need more information about evaluations and reading evaluations. We are honored to have Marcia Eckert here. Marcia has been a licensed psychologist for 35 years. She provides therapy and consultations with parents and schools for students with autism spectrum disorders, nonverbal learning disabilities, ADHD, and executive function issues. She has a specialty in diagnosing and working with individuals with spectrum challenges and nonverbal learning disabilities such as social skills, anxiety, inflexibility, and depression. She has written and lectured about the challenges of identifying girls and women on the spectrum who have not been previously diagnosed or understood. Dr. Eckert is a member of the Connecticut ASD Advisory Council and the Clinical Advisory Group of the Asperger's Autism Network, a national resource for autism services and education. She's on the Professional Advisory Board of Smart Kids with Learning Disabilities and the Board of Directors of NeuroClassic, a nonprofit that provides education and resources for autistic individuals and families. She's on the community medical staff at Norwalk Hospital, helped establish the Yale-Norwalk Hospital Collaboration Pediatric Department and Therapy Center, and was director of clinical programs for the New Learning Therapy Center. Dr. Eckert is the author of multiple articles on autism for the Journal of Health Services Psychology, and on both autism and nonverbal learning disabilities for Autism Spectrum News. A number of her articles are on our website as well. Her blog, Everyday Neurodiversity, is on Psychology Today. Dr. Eckert is a graduate of Yale University, earned her PhD in clinical psychology from the City University of New York, completed her internship and fellowship at New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, and trained with the Benson Henry Institute of Mass General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, to teach scientifically proven stress reduction techniques. We are really thrilled to have Marcia here today. For those of you who just make sure that you sign in for us so that you'll get a copy of this videotape. And in the back, we have a list of all of the presentations we did this year and the upcoming presentations. The next one is on March 1st and is about being on the same page, how parents can remain effective partners when raising kids with special needs. Thank you.
Are people who registered getting
Yes, everybody on our website, everybody on our.
registered.
Yes, everyone who registered and everyone who didn't register is going to get this, and then it'll be posted on the website.
Okay. I just wanted to say to make sure you all, if you haven't looked at the SpedNet website, you do, because most of the time when there's webinars or there's things like this, they charge, and you have to pay money to have access, and we might only have limited access. Everybody so many people have given talks for SpedNet on everything from literacy to, keeping your head screwed on straight when you're graduating from high school tech. Whatever you can think of, it's there, and it's all free in webinars and articles that so many of us have written. So I can't tell you what an amazing resource it is that this is available for free to everybody. So spednet.org, everybody. And and I'm primarily going to take questions at the end because I want you to, in case that what you're asking about is coming up. But I'm going to be trying my best to look at your faces to see if everybody's going, what? I'm going to, try to stay with that and make sure you get it. I'm going to do my best to put this in English as opposed to what I call psychobabble. And I'm for those of you who are here in person, thank you so much. After having spent 2 years giving webinars, looking enthusiastically at my computer, which doesn't look enthusiastically back, it just sits there. It's really nice to have live people and live faces. So those of you who are here, thank you so much. Now, let me tell you what this is and what this isn't. I'm not going to go into all the different psych tests that you're going to see. How many are parents, for one thing? Okay, great. So I'm not going to go into what all the psych tests are. For one thing, there's too many and we'd be here all day. For another thing, all you have to do is Google them and it will tell you what a particular test covers. Okay, there's lots of information online about each test and what it's testing for. So that information you're going to be able to get. What I'm going to be talking about is the numbers you're going to see that tell you look at this thing, you see all these numbers, and if you're not familiar with them, it's like, well, what does that mean? And how do I know if something's really important or something's not? So that's where we're going to go. And it's a little bit of a trip into the weeds, okay? There's a reason why those of us who did neuropsych testing, have these long reports because we're trying to explain all this stuff. But you guys are going to be ahead of the game because you're going to have the knowledge to know. And in some ways, it's not that difficult, but the language can be a little bit unfamiliar and overwhelming. So, and I'm trying to get used to this. Just so for the record, here are some of the psych tests that you're going to see in most batteries. There's tests of intelligence, of adjustment, of working memory, of, where the child's at in terms of educational level, visual motor integrations, looking at, different kinds of processing, processing speed. There's a lot of different tests. That's the bottom line of this one, okay? And this is where the numbers come in, right? And as you see, I put them in different colors. There's basically 3 kinds of scores. There's T-scores, there's standard scores, and there's scaled scores, okay? So we're going to be talking about all 3. And it's important to understand that there's these 3 kinds of scores. Now, the raw score is the actual number that is, based on the test. Okay, the raw score is, how many did you get right? That is a meaningless number, really, because if you're 7 years old and you got 5 right, you might be doing great. If you're 15 years old and you got 5 right, you might be doing terribly. So what they do is they give these tests to thousands and thousands of kids, and they figure out what's an average score, what's a high score, what's a low score for an age norm, which makes sense. You want your 15-year-old compared to other 15-year-olds. You want your 7-year-old compared to other 7-year-olds. And the scores they convert the raw scores into are the three kinds of scores I just told you about: the T-scores, the standard scores, and the scaled scores. Any questions on that one? I think that hopefully is still English. Well, let me go back. Yeah, so I'm trying to go backwards and it's not letting me. Okay. Oh, that's going backwards. Oh, wrong button. Okay, so these are all normal scores. And what we need to do is to figure out, you're going to be the numbers you're going to look at for the most part are the scores translated. Now, standard scores have a mean of 100. The average number that all these thousands of kids get is 100. And they have a standard deviation, I'm going to explain what that is, of 15. So if you see a score that's in the hundreds, or somewhere, say, between 85 and 100 something, that's probably going to be a scaled score. Okay, so the WISC IQ is a scaled score. Okay, a standard score, sorry. Scale scores are the scores of subtests. And those have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. As I said, I'm going to get back to these details. But that means if you see a number that's between, say, 1 and 17, it's going to be a scaled score. All right? And T-scores have a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. So what that means is if you see a score in the hundreds, you know it's a scaled score. If you see a score that's 1 to 17, I'm sorry, getting this wrong. It's a standard score. You see a number between 1 and 17, it's a scaled score, and you see a number that's 45, it's probably going to be a T-score, okay? So that you can have in mind, why is my kid getting a 45? I thought, people got in the hundreds. It's because it's a different kind of score. So you're all thinking, oh my God, standard deviations, what the heck is she talking about? Well, we're going into the weeds, folks, in terms of these kinds of things. I'm going to try to make it really clear. If you all are like, what? I'm going to, try to stay on it till it makes sense. Oops. So that's my reaction to statistics. And when I got my PhD, you were required to either show proficiency in 2 foreign languages or a foreign language in statistics. And that made total sense to me because to me, statistics was a foreign language. Luckily, I had gotten a good grade in my statistics class, so I didn't have to show any more proficiency than that. But you guys are really only going to have a few things to keep track of. And these are the things that are the most valuable, the most important to understand what those numbers mean when you're looking at your kids' testing. And it is important that you know what those numbers mean, because somebody like me who's OCD will make sure that everything is broken down in detail. Not everybody will, and schools sometimes will give you averages, or some people will give you averages which you really want to question. So I'm going to explain all this, but it is important for you to understand this. Most things you measure, like anything you measure, attention, height of American women, how much babies weigh, things like that, how big community centers are going to be distributed in what we call a normal curve. How many of you know what a normal curve is? Okay, so a lot of you do. Oh, wait a minute. It's hard for me to see the little things because it's dark up here. This is what a normal curve looks like. And so at the far end going that way is the kind of low end. There's the middle, which is what they call the mean. That's what most people get. And there's this curve, which is the people who are really high. So when it comes to attention, for example, there are people who are down at the low end, and those are the people who really can't, they have a lot of trouble paying attention. Most people are in the middle. That means attention isn't always 100%, but they're kind of, at the what we consider average. And people at this score are like hyper-focused. Okay, so everybody, pretty much, unless they're at that one far end, is going to have some issues with attention, but mostly be pretty okay with it. If we made this about the weight of babies, it would be a much thinner thing, a much thinner distribution, because, there's not that much difference. I mean, a small baby might weigh 3 pounds, a heavy baby, I've heard of one baby 11 pounds, but it's, it's not as big a spread. But if you're looking at the weight of American women, it's going to be a big spread, right? But there's always a mean, there's always this kind of shape. The standard deviation is an important number for you to know because it tells you how far something is from that big, tall mean, and it tells you how much of a difference you need to be significant. So if you're looking at two numbers and you want to say, well, is this a significant difference? This is with a number that tells you that. And so it's an important thing to understand that you need to know how big a difference between two numbers do I need before I start, saying, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? So just to drive this home endlessly, if you look at this chart, you can see that one standard deviation, in this case, we're talking about standard scores with a mean of 100, as you can see from the middle line, that means the average kid gets 100. The standard deviation up to 115 and down to 85 covers, almost 70% of people. So the odds are your kid is going to get a number somewhere in there because that's just about 70% of people. And you can see, which I'll say in specific later, that in this the standard deviation is 15. So if you're looking at IQ scores or you're looking at something else and it's varied by, say, 10 from one time to another, they're going to tell you that's not a significant difference, okay? So if you say, well, why is this 10 and what's 110? They're going to say that's not something that you worry about. Two standard deviations covers 95% of everybody. So if you are two standard deviations above the mean and you have an IQ of 130, that's a significant difference, isn't it? You're really, you're really smart. But if you're two standard deviations below, you're having more difficulty. You're 70, which is sort of the borderline of what people consider to be, intellectually capable. So that, people say there's an intellectual challenge if someone's below 70. And 3 standard deviations cover just about everybody. So these are standard scores. And up in the little corner, you can see standard scores are the scores you're going to see on a whisk for the most part. The full scale IQ is a standard score. The index scores are standard scores. You'll see it on the Woodcock-Johnson, which measures academic testing. You'll see it on the evaluation of language. When you see a score in the hundreds or in that range that we looked at, that is going to be a standard score. Scale scores are the scores on subtests. Most of these tests are made up of different subtests. It's not just one test. There's a test for vocabulary. There's a test for making abstractions. There's a test for maybe for visualization of numbers. There's a test for all kinds of different things. And so the subtests are going to have a mean of 10, that's average, and a standard deviation of 3. So if you see a WISC subtest and you see a 7, you know it's a standard deviation below average, okay? That means that there's something going on, right? If it's that's significantly below average. If you see a standard deviation, if you see 13, you know that's above average. That's somebody who has a strength. Okay, and if you see a scaled score of 17, if you see a scaled score of 16, then you know they're really, really doing well. This is an area of significant strength. And we're going to want to lean into this, right? We're going to want to lean into our kids' strengths. And just for the heck of it, I included the T-scores. You don't see as many of those, but they're used on that BASC, the Behavior Assessment Scale for Children, which is pretty much used for everybody. And they give it to you and they give it to the teacher, and it says, you know, talks about different kinds of adjustment things. And, you know, so you're going to look at a number from that. It's probably going to be, as you see, between, say, 30 and 70. If you have if you have a high score, you're doing, you know, that means your executive functions are really strong. If you have a low score, that means you have struggles with executive functions. So, hey, this is not so bad, right? You figure out what kind of score you have, and you look at the standard deviation, and you know what ballpark you're playing in, right? And you know that it's a strength, it's a weakness, and so that sounds pretty doable. So where do we get in trouble? Okay, why do you need this whole talk? I could have told you that, and we'd all be out of here in what? Half an hour. So things get a little gnarly from here on. Here's where we get in trouble. Take the whisk. And I'm just using it as an example because how many of your kids have had the whisk or the WAIS? Yeah, everybody. It's part of every test battery. The way the whisk is structured, you see a full-scale IQ. Everybody's seen a full-scale IQ, right? And sometimes there was when I helped create the Center for Pediatric Development at Norwalk Hospital, it turned out Yale was just telling people full-scale IQs. And I'm like, that is a totally meaningless number. Why are you bothering? Okay, why am I saying that? Well, because you can see there's a full-scale IQ, then you can see there's 5 different headings there. And under each heading, there's all those little subtests. And so each heading is made up of subtests, and the full thing is made up of subtests. So you've got all these different things making up each of these scores. So the WISC, as an example, has 5 index scores. And I'm not going to read the slide for you, but you can see there are different areas of functioning. And some of them have to do with areas of processing, like verbal versus visual. I talk about NLD a lot because it's what's going on with kids who have issues with visual functioning. But there are kids, for example, who have issues with verbal functioning. That there's also processing speed. That's an important thing to know. How quickly can a kid process? Working memory is another one. So these are all index scores. So what you're going to see is standard scores, that full-scale IQ, index scores, which are also those standard scores in the hundreds, but the subtests are going to be those nifty little scaled scores. So you're going to see numbers usually between 7 and 15, 16. Is where most people are going to be. That's 2 standard deviations. Oops, wrong way. So point number 1 I want you to take home is when you look at those index scores, you want to see, are they consistent? A main idea I want you to have here is the idea of consistency. We're looking for, are things consistent? So if you have, for example, a very strong verbal comprehension score, but a low processing speed or a low working memory is your kid may be very good verbally, but getting it into memory is a problem, okay? And where does that count? It's working memory is the immediate memory, okay? So the long-term memory might be good. They might be able to remember vocabulary really well or information really well, but you've got to get it in there. And so the kid who has issues with working memory, for example, taking notes is going to be a problem because you've got to listen to it, hear it, remember it, be writing it down, and still listening to things. So if you have issues with working memory or processing speed, your very bright verbal kid is going to be having trouble. So you want to know the difference between those index scores and what they're measuring and what that means. So you want to make sure that you are looking at that and looking for differences there. But, and this isn't just the WISC, okay? Just about all of these tests I mentioned are set up the same way. So you're going to see composite scores like an index score, and then you want to look across them and see and ask, what does it mean that this one is, say, one standard deviation above and one's one standard deviation below. But we have to talk about a standard deviation to be talking about a meaningfully big number. So just because two numbers aren't the same doesn't mean that they're significantly different. Do I have everybody so far? Okay, good. Heads are nodding for those of you who can't see. The variability of those subtests is called scatter. You don't really have to know that, except if somebody says there's a lot of scatter, that means there's a lot of variability. So take the verbal comprehension index, okay? That index is derived from adding together two subtest scores. What's the problem with that? Well, if you have two subtest scores that are both average, okay, average plus average, guess what that yields? Average, right? But let's say you have one subtest that's a standard deviation above normal. Let's say that their vocabulary subtest is a standard deviation up, but their similarity subtest, which is the subtest that has to do with formulating abstract concepts, is a standard deviation down. That's still going to add up to average. Okay, so that's like saying if my head's on fire and my feet are in a bucket of ice, I'm having average temperature. All right, so when you see that kind of discrepancy, what that means is this kid has a big fund of vocabulary, knows what a lot of words mean. But when it comes to coming up with the abstraction, what's the theme of this? Okay, well, how do I take this to a level that's not just factual? That kid is going to be struggling, even though they have a very high score in vocabulary. So that's where we're looking for these differences, okay, among the subtests. So my point number one, if I'm right about what my points are, so you're looking for remember, you're looking for three as a standard deviation. So if you see an 8 and a 10, that's not that different. You don't have to worry about that. So that's where you're going to have these slides. You don't have to memorize what these numbers, the differences are, but you know that that's what you're looking for when you're looking for how far apart do these things have to be before I say, hey, what's going on here? So if they're consistent, 10, 10, 10, 10, 13, 13, 13, 13, or 13, say 14, 13, 11, those aren't that different. I don't have to write home. But if you see something that's that's big difference, then I want to know what's going on here. Why are there significant strengths and significant weaknesses, and what impact does that have? That's our bottom line, right? What impact is that going to have on my child's ability to learn, to function in school? So here's a point. If there's a lot of scatter, if there's a lot of difference among these subtests, you want the discussion in the meeting you're having to look at that and to say, what is this strength? What is this area of challenge? And how is that going to affect the child? So as I use the example of, having a test of vocabulary versus abstraction, that, you don't want the average. What you want to know is, are there significant strengths and differences in terms of what the child is doing. If you have a test, take working memory, okay? One part of it is visual, motor, another part of it is verbal. Well, that's going to make a difference, right? Because visual might be taking in stuff on the board, right? It might be having to, look at stuff that's presented to you in a visual way. Whereas if you have verbal working memory problems, that means language coming in might be hard to hang on to. So that's where we're really kind of getting into the weeds and wanting them to pick it apart and say, what's going to be going on here? What's going to be a problem? Do I still have you? Most nods? Okay, good. So if you've got a lot of that scatter, that's where you want the discussion. Oh, I went back, sorry. So you want to have that discussion. Here's the point. Let's say all the numbers are above average and you get told, well, yeah, there's a difference, but it's all above average. So this is fine. My answer to this is no, it's not fine. I had one little 5-year-old tell me that, for example, his reading was the road runner, but his remembering was the coyote. Okay? And the coyote could not keep up with the road runner. So a child who's having a real area of strength, but an area that's only average, is going to be a frustrated child. Now, what does it mean when your kids are trying to learn and they're frustrated? It means, yeah, someone did this. It means it's going to be that they have trouble sticking with doing their homework because it's frustrating, right? Or they might get frustrated in class, and we need to know why. And it might, so even if we're talking about a score in the low hundreds and a score in the high hundreds, that's going to mean that this child is at one level going a mile a minute, and in another area they're going much slower. That disconnect is going to be frustrating. So just because they're all above average doesn't mean that it's not going to be an issue for the child. So that's pretty clear? Okay, good. So what are my recommendations about this? Number one, you want to make sure the team is discussing whatever kinds of discrepancies there are. You want to make sure that they're looking at discrepancies between those scores that are aggregating subtests. You want to make sure that there's a discussion of what discrepancies there are in those little scaled scores themselves. And you want to understand that what the impact is going to be on learning. You want to understand, well, what is this strength and what is this challenge area? Now, I've just been talking about one test, the WISC, okay? Guess what? We're comparing this not only within one test, but across all the tests. So if you have a really strong WISC, which is looking at intellectual potential and processing speed and things like that, but the tests like the Woodcock-Johnson, and you don't have to memorize these tests, remember, just Google them. You have a test like the Woodcock-Johnson, which is one kind measures certain cognitive things, another is academic. Often there'll be academic scores like that. If you've got a kid whose verbal comprehension is really strong on the Wechsler, but they're really only average on the test of academic achievement, you want to know why, right? You want to know how come. Or, for example, there's a test called the brief. Have all of you heard of the brief? Yes, no. The brief is the behavior rating inventory of executive function. It's my personal opinion that it is the strongest measure of executive functions because other measures are what a child can do with paper and pencil in front of me. Well, how often are things like executive functions, initiating work, being able to sustain your effort on the work, being able to plan and organize, how often is that something you do by yourself with one person actually structuring what you're doing, right? That doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, we're doing it in real life. And what the brief does, it asks about how well is this working in real life. So if somebody has a paper and pencil test saying the kid can do it, but the kid isn't doing it in real life, the question is why? So the brief, I find, is a terrific test. So a kid who's really bright, but who has poor executive functions, all of you know that kid. It's the kid who has trouble organizing, right? It's the kid who has trouble with time management. Really bright, but they're all over the place when it comes to knowing how long is something going to take. And you're saying, why are you waiting till the last minute? Well, that kid may not have a good sense of time. Or they may be delaying because this isn't something they understand, or it's frustrating to them, and they'd rather not deal with it until they come right up against the deadline. I confess that neuropsych test reports were sometimes that way. It's like, oh no, not another one. All right, I got to do this. I'm going to set a date. Okay, I'm going to do this. And those things were like 21 pages long, which is why I don't do them anymore. Don't call me to do neuropsych testing. I hung up my neuropsych testing hat. So executive functions are important because one executive function is transition, the ability to move between one thing and another. You say, well, I know that getting my kid out of the house in the morning is a transition, right? I've got to get them out of bed. I've got to get them to brush their teeth. I got to get them to put their clothes on. I got to get them to get all their stuff together. Clearly, that's a transition. And it takes working memory, and it takes a lot of these things. So all of these things apply to real life. The kid can't remember everything they're supposed to do. They forgot to take their Adderall in the morning. Or if the kid doesn't have a sense of time, it's 20 minutes later and they are still putting their clothes on. So the kinds of things we're measuring have to do with real life too. But within academics, think about writing. Writing is a perfect storm because you have to keep switching. You have to, number one, understand the question. Well, if your similarities, if your ability to abstract is hard for you, you might have a lot of information. You might have a lot of words at your disposal, but you might not know what it is they want to hear, okay? And so you have to think about what is it that the question is, what do I want to say? Then you have to switch to putting it into sentences and how to make a grammatic sentence. Then you have to switch to a motor skill of writing it all down. Then you have to switch to checking, making sure that what you wrote down is what you wanted to say and it says it in English and all that kind of has. And then you have to switch back to what idea do I have? And that's why you get a lot of kids who are smart, but they really kind of get stuck in writing because it has so many executive functions embedded in it. So these executive functions aren't just your kid's notepad and whether or not he knows what or she knows or they know what assignments are due. It's also the ability within something to do these things. And an executive function is initiation. Your kid may have a real hump getting over starting. Has anyone have a kid who has a hump getting over starting? Yeah, and so those kids may need some strategies for how do I get started. They need to actually do a sentence with somebody before they can get going. So these executive functions are important because even when a bright kid is trying to do something, they have to use executive functions to keep going. I do have a separate talk on executive functions. I won't give it now. You want interventions to address both the strengths and the weaknesses. Too often, our kids are defined by their deficits. In other words, if you have trouble with writing, even if you're very bright, even if you're great at reading, even if you love literature, you're placed in a class at the level of your writing. Well, what's that going to do to a kid? It's going to discourage them, right? The class is not discussing what they're reading at the level that they can. And that's going to be really, they also may feel that I'm in the dummy class, right? Or they may have, issues. And so what we don't want is our kids defined by their deficits. We want a kid where we're leaning into their strengths If this kid is really good at reading, really interested in literature, really, then maybe we want to go in there and have some accommodations about how much writing do they have to do or getting the help in writing, as opposed to reducing them to being somewhere where everything's at the level of their writing. You with me on this one? Because that's what happens so often. How would all of us feel if we're defined by our deficits? As I said, math is not my claim to fame. If you wanted me to, at sports, sorry, I am somewhat uncoordinated. That's how you defined me, and you said, well, she's not so good at things, I wouldn't be standing up here talking to you, right? Because you'd say, well, she's just this pile of deficits. Well, figuring out this stuff is one of my strengths. And hopefully explaining it to you is one of my strengths. So we want to help kids lean into their strengths, because that's what's going to take them into college. That's what's going to take them into life. And I tell the kids I work with, school is the only time where you're going to have to be good at everything, right? We expect them to be good at math. We expect them to be good at literature. We expect them to be good in history. You name it, you're supposed to be good at it, right? Once you get out of school, you do what you're good at, right? You would not want me as your bookkeeper. I promise you. Take my word for this. But working with your kid in other things, hey, I'm really good at that. So I just tell kids, your job is to keep your head screwed on straight long enough to get through school. And that's what we want to do. We want to help them understand that even if there are areas that are hard for you, you can still do fine in life. So basically, you have only a couple things here to remember. You've got to know what kind of scores you're dealing with. What numbers are those scores going to be likely to be in? And how big a difference do I need to see before I say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? And if you see inconsistencies at any level, then you want to know what's going on. If the scores of those scores of the components are really different, then the thing you get by averaging them is not going to be as meaningful, right? It's going to just tell you what an average is. Whereas, and then when you put it all together for a full scale thing, it's going to kind of put it all together. And that's why I said when Yale was just giving the kids the full scale IQ, well, that really didn't do much, because the full scale IQ, which is the WISC, I talk about intellectual potential, but it's not telling you whether the kid has executive functions that are lousy or good. So if you have a kid who has a really strong WISC, saying, okay, if that kid's not doing well, he has a bad attitude, is really, does disservice to the child. On the other hand, if some of the WISC scores are lower, but you've got a kid who's really strong in a lot of other areas and a kid who really works hard, then that kid might perform above what that number leads you to expect. And so it's really not that helpful to only look at the full scale numbers. So basically, this is what you need, just this much, to be able to look at all those numbers. And you're going to tell me, well, there's a lot of numbers. Yeah, there are, especially when you start looking across different tests. And you might say, well, can I compare one test to another? Well, it depends on what kind of scores you're talking about. Standard scores are more comparable to standard scores, but maybe the executive functions are measured with T-scores, so they're not directly comparable. But if you remember, there was a slide back a while that showed how, I can go back there if anyone wants to during Q&A, that shows in general, with the T-scores, if you're 2 standard deviations up, and with the standard scores, you're 2 deviations up, you're doing really well on both of those things, even if the numbers don't immediately compare. So I'm opening this up to questions, and hopefully yeah. I think there's a mic up here, and if you speak into the mic, the people watching this on recording will actually hear you.
So I just had a question about how some tests seem to be timed and other tests, there's sort of the option to time them or not time them, and finding where, well, I guess I'm speaking from personal experience with my son, but to find out if they actually really knew the material versus couldn't process it in time, seeing that they had a low processing speed, but then wanted to measure whether or not they knew what they were reading or understood it, understood it completely, was working as a detriment in some case because of anxiety that was building up with the, is there a test that tests for
Time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are tests for time. There's tests on the Woodcock-Johnson that look at how long does it take you to do simple math problems. How long does it take you to read a sentence? But bad news, folks, how often are math problems simply adding, 1 + 1 or 7 + 5, right? So you might be able to do that quickly, but still have trouble, as it gets more complicated. And also reading how fast, well, if you read sentences very slowly, obviously you're going to be a slow reader. But most of your kids are going to get to where they're reading chapter books, right? And if you have a kid, say, who has working memory issues, they may have to read and reread before they get what the content is in their head. So the issue of processing speed is really important. Sometimes it's not fully captured by the tests, but if you do see an issue, one of the things that I do, and you want to ask if you have someone doing an evaluation, is a simple thing, which is, did a child work up on the time tests? Did the child work up to where they just stopped getting them right? Because when they miss a certain number, that's when you stop giving them the test. You don't want to frustrate the heck out of them. But is it the kid get up to that cap, that point where they're reach their limit, or did the kid run out of time? And they still could have kept going and doing okay, but you stopped because of the time. I would, after I did that, after I wrote down the number of where they were at the time, I would then do what they call non-standard administration and say, keep going. And I'd find out how well can the kid do if I just give them the extra time. Because sometimes the child may not have reached their limit, they may have reached the limit of the time. And certainly you all know that an accommodation that's given is extra time. Now, if the problem is the kid reached his limit, extra time's not going to help, right? But if the kid has a lot of anxiety, or the kid's a slow processor, or the kid has problems that make it they have to read and reread, then we want to make sure the kid has the time to actually show us his or her or their potential, and not just the factor of running out of time. So that's a really good question. Yeah. I think the mic is around somewhere.
Coming.
Thank you. Well, my child is a 45-year-old adult at this point. And this is going back to, we'll say, in the late 80s and into the 90s, where she tested out being very bright, but she actually had ADD. And somebody would, this was a generalization. Very often ADD have high IQs. I don't know if that's really a misconception or not. But one of the things that we found, we had moved and changed school districts, that it was recommended that she also take what would be an emotional test to see where she falls in line with her peers. So even though she had been in gifted programs at the other school, when doing the test evaluation for emotional, they said she has a 6-month lag, which makes a difference when you're in like 1st, 2nd grade. And they often, at this school system, held kids back a year. So she would otherwise be competing with some kids that had almost 18 months chronological age difference, between emotional and in the classroom setting. Now, do some of these tests that are subtests, do they also evaluate emotionally where they are for dealing with some things? Because that was significant in this case.
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. And I'm going to give you two kinds of answers. To me, a paper and pencil test of emotional functioning can tell you something. But as a clinician, as a parent, as an educator, you know an awful lot about a kid's emotional level and how mature they are compared to their peers, because that's something you see acting out in real life. Now, remember that normal curve. Well, attention is on that normal curve, and so is intelligence. So no, all the ADHD kids are not necessarily going to be bright, but they're going to be creative. They're going to be out-of-the-box thinkers because they're not just focused on, those are the kids who are thinking, the teacher says, okay, I'm going to put a star by this, and the kid says, stars? I heard that there are nebula. I wonder what it would be like to go to a nebula. Well, gosh, there's an astronaut program, and that's the kid that's going to go off in that direction and, come up with all kinds of really cool ideas, but it's going to have maybe trouble sticking with what's being said. Or that's a kid who might be on the hyper side and need to move in order to, function well. So the ADHD is one bell curve, the attention is another bell curve. They're not going to be immediately overlapping each other. But I think, yes, in general, I think of kids who have differences are often socially, emotionally lagging. Okay, all of these things, sometimes we're not looking at a difference in potential, but rather a developmental lag. And so the kid who's, really ADHD, having trouble kind of staying focused, having trouble, dealing with impulsivity, might not be kind of developing those social skills or those emotional skills at the same speed. And we've got to understand that. And again, too often, I think some of these issues, if there's not performing at the level they're expected or they're not developing these skills, it's like, well, he should. He's 12 years old and he should be able to be doing this. To me, should is the least useful word in the human language. Because I could pick one of you out, or I could say me, I should be able to make a foul shot in the paint if you put me on a basketball court. Well, that's a joke, all right? To say just because you're 11, you should be able to keep your appointment pad in order is useless. The kid is where he is, right? And that's where we have to start. If I said you should be able to make a 4-course gourmet meal in an hour because that's what they do on Top Chef, that's not going to help you, is it? So the kid is where he, she, or they are, and that's where we start. And all it does really is batter their self-esteem to tell them you should be somewhere other than you are. They are where they are, and that's where we start, and we give them the encouragement and the information and the help to get to develop further. That's a very long answer. I hope I answered your question. Yeah. Just wait 1 second. I'm going to get the mic.
Thank you. If you're in a situation where you have a great deal of scatter, in general, would it be a good thing to then investigate further as far as what's going on, like with some other type of test? So say you have reading is, or if you have, let's say, slow memory or something, are there tests specifically gauged to that? And then the second part of that is, are there interventions listed anywhere to address the areas of concern?
The answer is generally yes and yes. I guess I should say more than that. Yes, there are tests of memory, okay? But again, somebody's memory one-on-one when you're alone in a room may not be quite the same as what your memory is when you're out in the world where there's noises and distractions and multiple things going on at once, and there a lot of information is coming at you simultaneously. So you not only want to look at the tests, you want to look at what's happening in real life. You know, one of the things they always talk about with ADHD is can the kid remember 3 directions? Or do they do number 1 and then they've forgotten number 2 and number 3? So that's a real life thing that is, regardless of what they do, you know, on a specific test. You can't say, well, he did well on this, so he doesn't have an issue. You as a parent, you see what the issues are, right? And so, yes, there are tests for everything, but as I said, a reading test is a reading sentences may not tell you how well this child is going to do reading a chapter book. So especially when you get to higher level things, you have to look at what exactly is the performance, and then take that test where the kid did poorly and sit down with the teacher, or have the teacher sit down and say, what went on here? What was the confusion? Is it the kid mixed up what the questions were, or is it that he didn't know what to give you as the answer, or this is a weak skill? We've got to sit down and really sort out in real life what is going on. Now, as far as interventions, yeah, there are interventions. There are interventions for many things, but I'll give you an example. I had I started working with him when he was 11, and I worked with him for a number of years because there were a lot of emotional issues in the family. But his way of processing vocabulary, now vocabulary is an untimed test, but you would actually his way of calculating similarities, of the being able to abstract. He would start out in one place and spend about 10 minutes talking his way through to the right answer, to the answer they were looking for, okay? He had to go through that process of thinking detail by detail all the way through till he got to where he wanted to be. And that is how he thought. There's a test called the TAT, the Thematic Apperception Test, where you show the child a picture and the kid makes up a story. There's a picture of a kid and there's something sitting in front of him. Many think it's a violin, some people think it's other things, and they make up a story. Well, he got this for his birthday. He's really disappointed because what he wanted is a Nintendo Switch, all right? Or this kid said, it's a late evening in November and it's raining. And this kid is sitting in his room, which is in the attic of the house, and he's really sad. And his name is Jonathan. And so Jonathan is sad, and the rain only makes him sadder because he's sitting there looking at and you get the idea. So the kid's tutor at Brown University, years later, calls me up and said, how do I get him to think fast? And I said, you don't. Because that's how he processes. He's a really bright kid, but he's not a kid where you want to have him on tight deadlines, right? And he actually told me he did better skipping classes because when he had the textbook or he had the notes and he had the time to do his way of working through things, he did incredibly well. But having to take it in from the teacher lecture just didn't work for him. So when I'm talking about interventions, there are some things that are very amenable. A kid who's dyslexic can learn other ways of reading, but this particular kid I'm talking about had a way of processing that was his way of processing. And in life, he did quite well. At Brown, he did quite well because he would do it his way. He'd skip the class, he'd go sit down with the teacher, the teaching assistant, and ask them a zillion questions that answered all of the little details he wanted to know in order to get to the right conclusion. So, so the interventions really depend on what we're talking about. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have a bunch of questions, actually. You totally described my son, who is a 10th grader and is having this big scatter, and specifically with the visual ability and very low processing speed and working memory. And so the first question is, can these skills be learned? I feel like we've had interventions over the years, and some areas, the executive functioning, we are drilling down. We're like, okay, it's not really motivation, that's the wrong word, it's initiation and planning and processing, planning. And so, and if the schools are not really teaching this, because I've been told they can be taught, but like executive function can be taught, but I don't know about, what about working memory? I feel like I've heard that it really is what it is, or maybe do they develop later? Is it a developmental delay? And processing, does that change, or is it what it is? And then I'll wait for the other question.
Okay. Now, I have a whole talk I gave on NLD. So you can look at that on the SpedNet website. NLD is nonverbal learning. It's a really badly titled thing. It's called nonverbal learning disability, but it's not about, the kids aren't nonverbal, they're very verbal, and it's not a learning disability. But it's the kids who score, weak in visual functioning and higher in verbal functioning. So it's just an aside. The answer is that you have to be, when kids have a particular area of deficit, for example, executive functioning, a lot of times what we're talking about is strategies and the willingness of somebody to work with the child, not to teach them a strategy, that is, this is the strategy I teach to everybody, right? But to come up with a strategy that works for the kid. I was just in a webinar last night, and so it's like webinar to things, what am I doing? And they were talking about a kid where the kid would like interrupt, constantly interrupt. Okay, well, inhibition is an executive function. Well, why was this kid interrupting? We have to go to the kid and understand the kid's experience. The kid was interrupting because he had working memory issues and he felt he wasn't going to remember his question. Okay, and the first suggestion was then write down your question. And the kid said, no, I'm a slow writer, that doesn't work for me. Okay, so what's another strategy? Well, the kid came up with the strategy, I'll just dictate it into voice recorder on my cell phone. What, you're not allowed to have cell phones in class? Well, maybe for this kid, having something that he can record a question on is an important thing. And the idea of interventions are not that everybody gets the same intervention, but rather everybody gets an intervention that raises them to a level where they can be successful. So that's where we get out of the box in terms of coming up with something that works for the child. I mean, I have on my phone everything. I have to put in time for lunch, which I normally accidentally miss. And we have put in time for, for the things that I need to do, and it's all in different color coded because that's how I need to have my phone. I have alerts on my phone. There's all kinds of technology that are there that can help kids with strategies. But the idea is nothing is one size fits all. You don't want to take a square peg and try to fit this child into a round hole, because all that does is it destroys the square peg. And the square peg feels terrible and has an image that I'm not good enough, all right? We want to come up with a strategy, understanding the experience of the square peg, and that works for the square peg. I'm actually writing a book on this right now, which is too many kids, I'm talking about kids on the spectrum, but it's true for kids with all differences, are going through school with the message of the most important thing is conformity. The most important thing is being, looking like everybody else. And that doesn't work. What we have to do is understand the kid's experience, validate your experience is your experience and that's valid, and find ways to work with that. And those strategies may sometimes be out of the box. I had one kid who had trouble handling frustration. He was in one school, and when he got really frustrated and he wanted to be good in math and he would get frustrated, the teacher would not let him take a break. He had to sit there in front of a math sheet, and he'd get more and more frustrated. And I said, can he take a break and walk to the back of the room? Well, he can have 1 minute. Well, when you're frustrated, does it take you 1 minute to calm down? And I said, well, why can't he have as long as it takes him? Because everybody will want to go to the back of the room, right? Give him an inch, he'll take a mile. Well, you know, the idea that giving our kids what they need is manipulation obviously isn't right. They need what they need. And so this kid was frustrated, and then he'd get really frustrated and he'd start crying, and he'd be under the seat or under the desk crying, and then he'd run out of the room. And so what did they call this kid? Did they call this a kid who had an issue with frustration and math, or did they call this kid a behavior problem? They called him a behavior problem. And so finally the school decided they would support an out-of-district placement, and I called the school where I'd like to see him go, which was Eagle Hill. And I said, please, please, please trust me on this. This kid is not going to be a behavior problem if you're giving him, number one, things he can do, and number two, you let him take a break if he gets frustrated. And so they said, well, okay, we'll trust you. And what happened is this kid, an OT who was brilliant, helped him work out that if he had trouble, he went out in the hall, he did wall push-ups. That worked for him. He came back in and he was able to start working. The kid was not a behavior problem in the slightest. Yeah.
That reminds me of most, we'll say generally, schools deal more with linear thinking as opposed to abstract. And whether some school philosophies like for Montessori, where they allow more for individual, you know, how they have to work to get through, you know. But because I found this too, that in the town where I live, the school's very linear. So it was, like you said, this kid, the example. So we did end up changing schools to a school system where, you know, there were more kids that were, okay, more abstract or able to deal with things, yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple people over there.
Hello. Oops. So I wanted to know the willingness of the child to participate in the neuropsych evaluation. How does that affect, you know, the scoring or the performance, as well as, you know, some neuropsych evaluations happen over 3 visits. You meet with the parents, then the next visit is with the child, and then the last visit is with the parents again. I know some neuropsychologists, they meet with the child 3 different times rather than base the entire test on 1 visit. So how do you go about choosing, you know, because we had a neuropsych evaluation done several years ago that I don't think really accurately described our child. We did it for ourselves, we kept it, you know, to ourselves, but if I were to do it again, I would like to choose someone different.
All right, I will tell you my prejudices, okay? They're my opinion. I did this for 25 years. When you're being tested, I am sitting across from you and I'm asking you to do thing after thing after thing after thing. Can you keep that up for 4 hours? I can't. I mean, and so I would break it up into sessions, and it would really depend on what the kid could tolerate. I want to look at optimal performance. Okay, I want to find out what the child can do, but I also want to include in my test report that he needs those breaks, right? So I want to know optimally what he can do, but also what does he, she, they need to do it. And so I break it into sessions that are manageable for the child. No, I don't break it into 5-minute sessions. We'd be there for a year. But generally, you know, 45 minutes to 2 hours, you know, covers just about everybody. And so I break it into sessions. Attitude, you know, one of the things that's important, no matter what you're doing, whether you're a parent, you're a special ed person, you're a psychologist doing testing, is you have to have a relationship of trust with the kid, right? You have to have a relationship where the kid feels you've got their back. You're in their corner. You're not out to sort of make them look bad. You accept them as who they are. And so you take some time talking to the kid, establishing a relationship where the kid may have had very negative experiences in the past and come to something with the attitude that somebody's just going to, say I'm dumb, right? And they just want to prove I'm dumb. And what you want to say is, hey, I know you, and everybody's got things they're good at. There are things that they're not so good at. I'm really good with language, but don't ask me to do math. It's true for everybody. Don't worry about it. And there's kind of a rapport. And most people who do testing, that's part of what they do, is build that kind of rapport. Now, if you're in a pressure situation where you've got to do a lot of testing very fast, which happens to a lot of school psychologists, they're kind of pressured in having to do that quickly. And my heart goes out to them. But that's something that we all try to do. And the same thing is true for special ed or for a pullout or for anything. The child has to feel a sense of I am regarded positively. Right? And people are going to accept me and help me move forward. And so that's a critical thing for a child's attitude. Children want to do well. You introduce me to a kid who doesn't fundamentally want to do well. But we need to feel this is going to help me do well, and I'm going to be seen as, I'm going to be respected as who I am. And that's why I kept saying lean into the strengths, because that's where you get a sense of competency, right, in your strengths, whatever they are. So we want to say, I see you. I know you're really, really good at these things. If we look at some things that are challenges, don't worry about that. Did I?
Yeah, so, would you agree that having like 5 sessions makes more sense where 3 are with the kids and 2 are with the parents, or?
Well, it really depends on what you're handling. If you're dealing with a child who, is really good at sustaining attention, they're over at that end of the curve, and they can sustain my attention long enough to be there too, which usually I can. They might tolerate a longer time, but I always broke it up at least into 2.
Okay.
2 sessions. As far as the parents go, again, it depends on how much do I have to explain. If we're just talking about one specific area, that might take one time of an hour, hour and a half. If we're talking, unfortunately, challenges are like Chinese menus. There's one from column A, one from column B, one from column C, and you have the interaction of those things together with the child's experience in school. And so, it gets complicated. In those cases, it might take multiple sessions talking to the parents and talking to the school about, how does all this work together, and how do we, help this child? Because more kids are complicated than not.
And if you're finding the neuropsychologist on your own versus through the school, is there any advice on which questions to ask or how to go about finding someone who is going to, take the time to meet with your child and get to know them?
Well, if you're looking for somebody, who is an independent evaluator, sometimes schools will pay for an independent evaluator. Or if you're looking for an evaluator on your own, be sure the school is going to pay attention to them, because some school districts have a policy of, we don't want to hear from outside psychologists. So, take that into account. But ask them. Number one, you want to ask people. You might go to Sped, or you might go to somewhere and say, are there people you recommend? But you also want to ask them, how do you do this? Do you do this all in one session? Do you sometimes do things non-standard to see the limits of how well my child does? And, get a sense of, is the way I looked at doing neuropsych evaluations was my job was to understand the kid, not to simply do a battery of tests. And so if I needed to do some more tests to really understand and you need to do tests because they only believe in numbers. So you have to have a normed number that supports what it is you think. So sometimes you have to kind of do some extra things to get numbers to support saying something further than just, what you think. But my job was to really sit down. So when I sat down with you, you said, boy, you really get my kid. Okay, and that's what you're looking for, somebody who really wants to get your kid and not just work their way through, okay, this. Does that make sense? And so when you talk to someone, just get, see if you can get that kind of sense of them. Yeah.
Thanks. This is really helpful. So, can you just explain the series of tests which my daughter has had?
The theory of
the timing. So, she's gone through the tests in 2nd grade, then 5th grade, then I think will it be 8th grade? And what is the advantage of and disadvantages and changes that you might see? You keep hearing that this isn't going to change.
okay.
But it did for us between 2 tests, and it was very confusing for my husband and I. Can you just kind of talk about that a little bit? Is it one and done, or like from she's in a public school standpoint?
Right. Well, we want to know a couple things. Sometimes there is, as somebody mentioned, developmental lag. And so you want to see over time, does something, go up a bit because the child is, maybe a slower bloomer in certain executive functions. Executive functions theoretically develop, they start coming in around age, 11, 12, somewhere like that. And they're still developing until you're in their 30s. I don't know about you, but I'm still developing mine, and I hate to tell you how old I am. But, so we want to see, is there some developmental, progress, change happening over time? You also want to see the opposite, which is the discrepancy between my kid who is kind of staying at the same level and other kids who are moving up, getting greater over time. And especially, say, in academic performance. Maybe a kid who was going along reading, just below the level of other kids is really falling behind because they're not making those sorts of advances at the rate. And the kid may need to be getting a fine program, but need more time to absorb it. And so those are the kinds of things they generally call for retesting every 3 years. And the standardized tests, the ACT, the SAT, and all those want testing within, I think, 2 years, and and documentation of whatever accommodations you're asking for. So they're going to want testing if it's longer than 2 years, or I think it used to be 2 years. Yeah. This is all a test of patience.
Thanks. I wanted to say something about what you were saying about going to Eagle Hill. So my son needed to be able to go out and get out his frustration or whatever it was in kindergarten, and didn't have to go to Eagle Hill to have that opportunity. But there was a trampoline right outside the front door, and then there was a pull-up bar in the cafeteria, which was right by his room. So there are ways of making it work in public schools, as long as you have people who care about what they're doing in public schools, as well as, yes.
Yeah, I think, Eva's making a really important point. Schools differ. And some schools will really be wanting to, feeling that they are able to make accommodations and let the kid go outside and jump on the trampoline if he needs to. Or OTs can be very helpful in coming up with sensory ways of calming down. For those who are interested, there's a site called, I think, Autism Level Up, but it's strategies that work for self-calming, and they're sensory strategies, okay? But it's, there are schools that are really open to that kind of thing. The school where the kid went to Eagle Hill was very rigid, okay? And if I give the kid more than a minute, I'm gonna have to give every kid more than a minute. They were very rigid about how how they did it. And so it really does depend on the school. And all therapeutic schools aren't alike. I had one kid who, he was a bit of a maverick, and so he kind of marched to his own drum, which is why he was in the school, right? And and so he, like, to him, if the rule was you don't sit on the piano bench that's out in the lobby, he thought, well, it's there, it's a piano bench, why can't I sit on it? He'd sit on it, right? And so, or he'd get fascinated by the computer and he didn't have a good sense of time, he'd be late to class. And so they were struggling with him because he was breaking the rules. And so they said to me, well, you know, he has to follow all our rules. And I said, well, you know, telling somebody you have to do everything is probably not helpful. Why don't you come up with 3 things you want them to work on? They had 3 things. Number 1, don't sit on the piano bench. Number 2, you know, get to class on time. Okay. Number 3, do all the rest of the rules in the school handbook. And I'm like, no, that's not a good number 3. So they picked a number 3. And so the kid was really working hard to do those 3 things. And he came in to me and he said, you know, the way they work in these classes, if you're really doing well, you get a commendation. I am working and I haven't gotten any commendations. So I went back to the head of the school. Of course, I was really popular there at this point, right? And I said, you know, how is it true? Because, you know, Jim feels he's not getting any commendations. He said, yeah, because the teachers are still mad at him. I mean, this is a frigging therapeutic school, right? I mean, you're the grown-up. You're not supposed to be mad at him. So all public schools are not places that are problems. Many are very accommodating and very willing to work with the kids' experience. And not all therapeutic schools are going to be wonderful in terms of doing what we want. So it's not a, you know, one is good, one is the bad. It's really, you know, kind of how they work and their willingness to go to understand the experience of the child and work with the child. Well, thank you all. You've been a great audience. And I just hope this gives you something that you can really take and work with. And the slides are there, so you don't have to remember what all these numbers are, but it'll give you something for looking at the tests. So I hope they got that out of this. Do I contribute a lot to SpedNet?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch on Marcy's page. There's a bunch of her articles. We're going to add even more articles, and there are more of her presentations.
Yeah, and this is me, okay? That's an older picture, but hopefully I still look a little bit like that. And that's my website, and that's my Gmail. I warn you, I get 100 Gmails a day. I'm still struggling to answer phone messages from January because I get so many of them. So if I don't get back to you, just, you know, shoot me another one. I'm doing my best. Yeah.
Do you think, my son's psychiatrist used the term twice exceptional recently.
I'm sorry?
My son's psychiatrist used the term twice exceptional because of the scatter. Is that a useful framework of thinking about things?
Yeah, really, really, really good question. I have a friend who has a daughter, and she, if you look at her testing, she is through the roof, okay? But she has a lot of issues performing in school. She's twice exceptional. Not only does she have some issues, but she's also bored out of her mind in school, right? And at certain times she just says, why should I do this? And a psychiatrist was evaluating her, and she was sort of like, and the evaluation, the psychiatrist, oh, she must have ADHD. And so that they took her aside, they asked her questions. She knew every single thing that had been said in that class, okay? A kid who's twice exceptional means there's They might be gifted, they might be very bright, there's something else going on as well. So there are two different categories in which they have to be understood in special ways. And so the kid who's twice exceptional but has a learning issue obviously is going to be struggling with their giftedness, but also having an area that's hard. Or they might have a lot of issues with anxiety, or they might have other kinds of issues. And so twice exceptional means there's two things you need to pay attention to. There's an entire literature and groups of people that are talking about gifted kids and twice exceptional kids. And, but you need to understand this is a kid with strengths. Remember what I said, you have to lean into strengths. And so the kid who is not in that normal 2 standard deviation thing might find that they have strengths that are kind of out there that are not being leaned into. And their experience at school might be, hey, this is boring or whatever. And so, you really, when a kid is twice exceptional, you want to make sure you're paying attention to the strengths as well as whatever the other challenges are. Sure.
So in going outside the school, I'm wondering if the school can only do so much. My son has, and tremendous help here in Wilton, but there's a certain amount I feel like maybe we need to go outside the school. And I found a great summer program for a month at a school that's for dyslexia and executive function up in Litchfield. And but I'm wondering, at what point do you add a tutor? Do you add a tutor for the executive function, and the school systems one was terrible over the summer. They did nothing. It was horrible. Or is that more pressure because this kid also does have anxiety, which we're addressing as well. So I don't know where that fine line is with, okay, how much of anxiety comes from a lack of executive function, and you're brilliant, and and then do you outsource it or do we just have to hang on tight until those things develop?
Right.
I feel like the pressure of time is running out before college.
Yeah, I think for any kid, if you think of school as a stream or as a river, and if the current is going faster than they can keep up, that is going to be anxiety arousing, right? And it might even be depressing. And so anxiety gets in the way of performance in addition to whatever else is going on. So, that's something we have to pay attention to, is the pace of what's going on, something that's impacting the child. As far as, supplementing, absolutely. If your child has interests, remember, we want to use strengths. Robert Brooks has a whole thing about mastery and islands of competence. And if your child has islands of competence, areas in which they're strong, you want to lean into them. You want to let them develop them. And it doesn't matter what they are. It might be skateboard tricks. We want our kids to feel that their competence is something that's valued. And I'll just give you an example. I had a mom she was the person I was seeing, and her daughter wanted to go into theater. Great, theater is great, but she wanted to do makeup. Well, these parents happened to think that doing makeup wasn't that cool a thing to do. It wasn't, they didn't particularly value it. They didn't want her to do makeup. They wanted her to be, on the stage. But the kid wanted to do makeup. And I said, look, if she loves makeup, go with makeup, go with her interest, go with what she feels is her strength. Well, this kid was so good at makeup that she not only did everybody in the cast, but they had her do all the makeup for the huge Halloween thing that this school did, because she was better at making people into ghouls than anybody else. And this kid really developed a standing in the school for her ability to do this. And so it's just a good example where we don't want to judge the areas of strength and say that's a good one or bad one. We want to lean into it and give our kids a sense that I'm a person, I have areas that are challenging, but I also have my competencies. And you know, the kid who's good on the skateboard trick has good visual spatial skills, they have good visual motor skills, they have a good sense of timing, they have good athletic skills, they have all kinds of good skills that if we called it all those things, they have good executive functions in terms of being able to switch and, you know, and inhibit other responses that are going to get in their way. If we were to break it down into all the things you have to do a good skateboard trick, we'd say, wow, that's really impressive. Okay, so we want to lean into those strengths. The question about getting a tutor is an interesting one. Not everybody can afford tutors. You know, schools are, my heart goes out to schools because people don't go into education to get rich, and people don't go into education because they don't want to help children. They go into education because they really do want to help children be successful. That said, schools are expected to do everything. I have teachers who tell me they've got a class of 25 and 11 of them have IEPs, and that it's just about impossible for them to do everything in 11 IEPs at once. And they also have a limited resources. And that's just a function because, you know, even though we put a lot of money into schools, it's hard to have the resources for everybody. And so if your kid is getting resources and the school is working with you and trying to do what they can, but your child needs more help and you can afford a tutor, that's great. And executive function tutors, I find, can be incredibly helpful because they can, you know, really get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. And I sometimes use an executive function, you know, coach, and I'll call her and I'll say, hey, you know, I am just up to here and just keep me on track. Because sometimes just meeting with somebody helps you keep on track. That might happen in the school, but it might be something you do with tutoring. Yeah.
There are also executive function coaches
Yeah,
that are different from
that's
tutors. And then there are social workers who take insurance sometimes, who I've used a series of social workers who teach executive function skills.
Okay, and so
who
now
might
I'm
be
going to
able
do
to
Eve
take-
a real non-favor by saying she knows an awful lot about who's out there. There are people like her who know an awful lot about who's out there. And so executive function coach, you know, you're right, it's not executive function tutor, executive function coach. They're out there. Many of them are really expensive. There might be somebody who has something that's billable and reimbursable. So obviously that's something that if you can find it, you'd like it. Yeah.
So I hear a lot about executive function and executive function coaching. What if that's not your child's issue? And I'm told that it's not executive function, but she has other learning disabilities. Are there tutors for that?
Yeah, I mean, there are tutors for,
How would you go about finding that though? Like,
well, that's again a good question. A lot of time having a parent network like SpedNet or some other parent networks are helpful because you can ask, you know, who people have used. I had a girl who was really struggling in math, and at that time at Fairfield University, there was somebody who oversaw the special ed department, and her special thing was math, and she would take somebody who was like 14 and in algebra and bring them back to manipulatives to help them get the idea of what they were doing, and the kid ended up getting it. And so, you know, you want somebody who has experience in working with a kid. You want to make sure they're experienced in the subject matter your kid is working with. And you also want to see, does the person end up having a rapport with your child? And is the child able to really get what they need from the tutoring? I have one boy who is really struggling in the math he's in, and he needs a tutor twice a week to kind of help him consolidate what he's doing. And so, you know, one particular tutor's way of teaching may be good for this kid, but not as good for that kid. So you really want to see is there a rapport, and how well are they meshing in terms of learning. and asking in parent networks. I know there's a Facebook group of parents of special need kids. Try to get recommendations from people. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all for your attention and for being here so that I'm not talking at my computer. And all those who are seeing this on a webinar, hi.